So I've been asked to come and talk about a downer of a subject, which is censorship. Now, in a free society, we instinctively think that censorship is always bad. But every system practices it, and censorship can actually be important and useful. Honestly, most people like at least a little bit of censorship. It's really hard to be free, because when we have access to so much information, we're expected to use that information to make decisions. And how many times have you heard a friend say, this is so hard, I don't know how to choose, I wish someone would just choose for me. I hear this all the time. And it's not just about being in a grocery store and figuring out what to buy. It's also about choosing a major, deciding what internship to do, which party to go to, how you want to spend your free time. And you've probably felt that way yourself, paralyzed by choice and wishing that you didn't have to make a decision. Well, when you're being censored, somebody's doing that for you. They're just making the difficult decisions, they're deciding what you need to know, and let's be honest, it makes your life simpler and easier. Okay. Now, of course, it matters why they censor and in what ways they censor. So in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about more traditional censorship, like book burning, arresting uncooperative journalists, cutting off internet access. But I want to start with something a little more benign, which is controlling ideas in the classroom. So as a teacher, you have a lot of control. I have a lot of control over the ideas because I'm the authority figure. I dictate the curriculum. And in fact, education is all about controlling the flow and content of ideas. But there is so much information out there, and the fundamental challenge in education is how you actually make sense of all this information. And is it possible that having too much information too soon is going to be harmful to students? And this leads us to ask, is there some value to censoring ideas in a classroom? And if so, what does censorship mean in this context, and how should it be done? Now, I think there are two reasons for restricting information in the class. Right? The first is you really want to control and limit the students' development. But the second would be that you want to aid their development. Now, as a parent, you want to do the second, right? And this is why we send our kids to school and why we teach them things at home. You want to raise a particular kind of child, namely one who's going to live to be a successful adult without you in the future. Right. And I firmly believe in all the other things that education can do. It can advance the frontiers of knowledge, can expose you to new things, encourage creativity, develop your unique capacities. But the single most basic goal of education is to create independent, functioning adults. How do you do that? You do this through scaffolding. Right? And it's just like training students for a musical performance. You start with basic scales and arpeggios, and you give them pieces that are appropriate for their level, and you gradually build their technique and develop their skills in this context. Intellectual development is really no different at all from physical development, okay, for three reasons. First is that students might not be ready for complicated facts. So you start them with simple ones, and you complicate their lives later. For example, we all learned that classical Greece was a democracy. Now, it's a particular kind of democracy. It was a direct democracy. And it was only partly a democracy. It's limited to a specific group of people, only for adult males who had completed their military training. In the US, we also learned in the beginning that the Civil War was fought over slavery. Only later do you learn that it was really fought over states' rights. But states' rights is a complicated idea. In order to understand states' rights, you have to understand federalism. To understand federalism, you have to understand constitutionalism, and so on. So this is all too much for students to wrap their heads around in the beginning. And in the classroom, you really are trying to take all this information that's out there in the world. It really is like a raging river. And you're trying to effectively control its flow so that it's useful and effective and not dangerous, much like a dam. It's the Three Gorges Dam, is supposed to be doing. The second reason you want to control information is that students might not be able to properly evaluate the quality and reliability and relevance of the information. This is a problem that's made much more acute with technology. So setting aside all the obvious problems of distractions, I know that my kids are on Facebook and WhatsApp all day in class. It's dark, so you guys might be doing it too, and I just can't see. But any idea or event that you mention, students can instantly Google it, and they're going to find more information online than you could possibly ever know. And this is a great thing, right? And it's a really useful tool in the classroom. But it comes with some dangers, okay? It can make students lazy. It can condition them to finding quick answers. And a lot of times, students will think, well, if I can't find it in the first 3 pages of Google, then it doesn't exist, all right? So they might settle for something else. They might, give you an answer that doesn't answer the question. Okay. So there's hugely varying quality of information out there, not just on the internet. And so the question is, how do you know if the information is any good? How do you know if the source is reliable? How do you know if the information is even relevant? Right? There are lots of urban legends that get passed around out there. One of my favorites is that canola oil, because it's made from rapeseed, which is the same thing that's used to make mustard gas, that canola oil is poisonous, and you shouldn't eat it. So, and especially if you're accustomed to things in print or newspaper being authoritative and reliable, you might not understand the free-for-all that's the internet, and this is where you get all this information. Also, in the US, I have lots of friends who get all of their news from The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Now, The Daily Show is not wrong, right? But it's going to give you a very skewed view of the world. So it really does take a certain amount of experience and knowledge to filter out the information, make sense of everything that's out there, and decide what's useful for you. The third reason you want to control ideas, to scaffold, is that students can't understand complex and difficult ideas right away. And I'm not just talking about violence or sex. Right? My parents paid no attention to what I was reading. I read all sorts of terrible sci-fi fantasy when I was young. I think I watched Bloodsport when I was 7 or 8. Yeah. But they wouldn't let me watch Donald Duck because they didn't want me to learn to talk like Donald Duck. So. But I'm talking about ideas, difficult ideas like toleration or liberalism. Scaffolding toward these ideas is incredibly difficult, but you can't achieve it directly. In order to fully understand or exercise toleration or liberalism, it requires that students have to learn how to make judgments. It's a fine line between teaching students toleration and teaching them moral relativism, the idea that everything is okay, or anything is okay. And it's really hard to complicate their ideas about really difficult problems, whether it's the environment, poverty, or the Middle East, problems that seem unsolvable. And it's hard to complicate their world in this way, but without leaving them feeling hopeless or nihilistic. You want to give students something to work with, but without destroying their ability to think for themselves, to make actual judgments. And this poses a huge challenge for parents because you have to make children do things and behave in ways that are different from how you want them to behave as adults. And you do that in order so they can behave differently as adults. Let's give you a couple small examples from the classroom. With writing skills, before students can take liberties with them, with form and punctuation and grammar, you have to learn what the rules are in order to effectively break them. Right? Otherwise, you just get bad grammar, and it's not artistic at all. If any of you read poetry, I guarantee you that E.E. Cummings knows how to punctuate properly, but he chooses not to for very particular reasons, and he understands why. Also recently, I had a graduate student who really wanted to write a thesis about that would argue for abolishing private property. I told him he couldn't do it. All right? And I think he probably thinks that I'm politically censoring him. Okay. But the truth is that it's an enormously difficult and ambitious project, and he's not capable of making a good argument for this yet, from what I have seen. And so I assigned him a different topic. It's a much more specific question, requires close textual analysis, and it doesn't argue for abolishing private property. But doing that is going to give him some of the skills that he needs to tackle the first project. So as you can see, restricting ideas and controlling content, these are actually really important parts of a child's development, and therefore an important part of the parent-child relationship, and as a proxy, the teacher-student relationship. So now the question is, what kind of skills are you trying to develop? What are you scaffolding toward? Well, your goals are going to depend actually on this kind of society you live in. So just like parents they want to raise a child who reflects their values, the state actually has a vested interest in molding a citizen that's appropriate to his system. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to stay over here. And education is a legitimate way of shaping the kind of citizen that you want. So for example, if you were a religious theocracy, you'd be justified in promoting state religion and restricting the practice of other religions. If you're a liberal democracy, right, school's going to teach you that you resolve conflicts, you make policy decisions through voting. And if you're an authoritarian government, school's going to teach you you're going to promote paternalism, right? You're going to learn that the state is always acting in people's best interests. Now, an authoritarian system might still encourage a lot of creativity and individuality and criticism, but always within limits, right? It's not going to be, you're going to be taught to not apply those abilities to rulers or to the government. Now, when I say that states are justified in molding their citizens to suit the system, it sounds as if I am advocating moral relativism, that whatever governmental system you have in place is going to be the right one to dictate the kind of education that you get. And most states are going to happily sign on to this, right? But there is a catch, and the catch lies in what it means to be an independent, functioning adult. Okay, so as a child, as a parent, you want your child to be able to hold down a job and to be able to pay the bills, but that's not all. Right? I think that as a parent, you should also want your children to be better than you and to do better for their own children. And I think this is true for most parents. And this means that your children have to be able to think independently and reflect on the way that they live their lives and reflect on the way that you raise them, and to be able to endorse and reject different aspects of their upbringing in order to make those improvements. If you're a good parent, that's what you should want. Why do I mention this? It's because most authoritarian states explicitly compare themselves to parents, and they justify the censorship that they do in the name of parenting. And so as good parents, or rulers, the state should want to raise independent, functioning adults. But not just ones who are going to work hard, to contribute independently to the economy. They're going to want, or they should want ones who have the ability to criticize their upbringing and their parents, in other words, their education and their government, and to make changes to it. So it turns out that this isn't relativistic at all. This instead requires a particular kind of moral absolutism. The idea that adults have to be autonomous, and not just autonomous in the areas that the government prescribes. And I think this is what it means to be truly paternalistic. And this is what most authoritarian systems have to do in order to be consistent with how they describe themselves. And so the question is, what happens with paternalism that goes wrong? Right? When you never remove the scaffolding, when you never teach the child the complex ideas at the end, when you never let the child engage in independent reflection, this is when you get censorship, right? And censorship is really incomplete scaffolding. Whoops. And what happens is a child who then becomes an adult gets stuck in the middle of his development. All right, and we find that it's very common and easy to control the ideas in the class. You do a lot of scaffolding and development of the child, but then you never finish the job. Right? And I think this is exactly what we see here in Hong Kong. This is why history is so strongly de-emphasized in the Hong Kong curriculum. Originally under the British, now continued under the Chinese. The history you get in primary and secondary schools is really disjointed. You learn a little bit about the US during the Depression, then the Tang Dynasty, then the invention of the printing press. And there's no real connection being drawn with anything. They learn a lot of history indirectly in the schools through literature and poetry. But under the new liberal studies curriculum that they have now, you're going to learn bits and pieces here and there up through the 1911 revolution, and then bam, suddenly we're in the present and we're this emerging economic powerhouse. So it means that our students are good at so many other things, right? But the curriculum, it doesn't give them the ability to analyze history. And that means that they can't understand the complicated dynamics of the society they live in. they don't really understand the language they speak, right? Language is historically rooted. They don't understand human nature, and they don't understand national nature. And so all this information that they get, gets funneled into this very specific track in order to develop them, but nothing comes out on the other side. All right? Their worlds aren't broadened again, in a new way, now that they've undergone all of this scaffolding and training. Instead, all this information flows into this narrow path, and it just gets stuck. So you are kind of like in Plato's cave, right? You get a functioning society and a very prosperous society, but also a very distorted view of the world. So where does that leave us? I think that when you're educating the student, you're educating two different entities at the same time. You're educating the person and the citizen. Now, when we educate the person, this is usually considered private education. You're trying to develop their character, their morality, and their sense of judgment. When you're educating the citizen, this is public education. Here, you teach students to love the country, whatever that means. You teach them to understand and accept the values of the society and to develop skills that are going to contribute to society and keep it running. Now, obviously, the kind of man and the kind of citizen you want will be related to each other depending on the kind of regime. So when we decide what ideas to present, which ideas to withhold, you have to consider whether you're educating the man or the citizen. Now, schools have a mixed mandate. They're supposed to do both. You're supposed to educate man and citizen, but they're going to place different weights on each depending on the kind of system you live in. So authoritarian systems of any kind, whether they're religious or secular, they're going to emphasize educating the man. Beyond patriotism and accepting societal values, there's very little education of the citizen, and this is where you get a lot of straightforward censorship. If you're in a more liberal system, they tend to, although they don't have to, leave education of the man mostly to the parents, and they spend relatively more time educating the citizen. But that's because it's more personally demanding to be a citizen. All right. What about things in between, systems in between? What kind of education is appropriate for changing a restrictive system into a new one? I think we actually assume that it's the same education that you need for a free system, but I think actually it requires something different and something much more heroic. Okay? You have to prepare students for future political struggle. It's kind of like you see lots of examples for example, in the U.S. struggle against racism. You had an alternative education of black youth at home and in the church. Now, this kind of education cannot be public, obviously, because the state is going to condemn it. This is why it's so tricky, because the education that's appropriate for a transitional society is not appropriate later on once the system is changed. Otherwise, you're just going to get continuous revolution. And this is a challenge that we have here in Hong Kong, because in this 50-year period, we have to transition to something else, but we don't know what it is. And so we have to think about how to shape and limit our students' knowledge in ways that are going to allow them to change the system, but also be able to transform themselves along with the system without really knowing where they're going to end up. Okay? And this is why it's incredibly challenging, because you have to instill different sets of characteristics. I'm out of time, so basically, you have two different types of characteristics. For the transition, you want people to be heroic, all right, and to risk their lives or at least their life prospects. But for afterwards, you want them to be self-disciplined and prudent. You want them to have complete confidence in the rightness of their ideas and arrogance, but also sincere humility and understanding of their limitations for afterwards. And this is why it's challenging, right? Because we cannot, in the schools, instill both these sets of things, and to also teach students to know when to use what. I think schools are just going to fail at this. We've heard already about the limitations. But I think there's some hope for this, which is that the kind of education I'm talking about is education of the man. And that is not going to happen in schools. The state's going to censor that until it dies. But the things that you really want are going to be developed in civil society, in volunteering, in the community, in outside of the classroom. That's where private education is most effective. And for a transitional society, this is where you are going to get the tools for throwing off the censorship in the end, completing the scaffolding, and becoming a fully autonomous citizen. Thank you.